Yo, what up y'all? IntraVenus here, back with another episode. Today I wanted to talk about the Game Boy Advance, but more specifically, how you can play physical cartridges in the year 2024. In general, Game Boys and physical cartridges are becoming more popular again, and you'll see them more in media as time's going on here, I think, as a new Doom game just came out for the Super Nintendo, and people are constantly making new games for cartridge-based consoles. So, if you happen to be a person like me with a lot of Game Boy Advance cartridges, and you want to play Game Boy games, but I'm not talking about emulating with ROMs and stacking them on a Chinese game handheld or something like that. I'm talking about the physical cartridges, be it repros or even your EverDrive. You want to play the physical cartridge on an actual handheld that you can maybe move the cartridge from one device to another and utilize your save. Sometimes even on the TV. Well, today I'm going to show you how to do that. We're going to cover 5 different ways you can play your physical Game Boy Advance cartridges, counting down to number 1, which is what I think is the preferred method of playing them. So let's go ahead and get started. Alright, starting out with number 5 is the Hyperkin Retron 5. This is actually a game console for your TV, and it allows you to not only play Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, Nintendo, Famicom, and more, but it has a Game Boy Advance slot right on the front next to the power button, and this allows you to play your physical Game Boy Advance cartridges using a controller. On the sides you have ports for NES, Genesis, and Super Nintendo style controllers, and you can make your pick, because you can use any of those to play your Game Boy Advance games. And you can play your repros or your physical original cartridges straight from Nintendo. Let's give an example. Alright, so out of our 5 choices today for playing physical Game Boy Advance cartridges, only 2 of them can also play your Game Boy cartridges. So that is important to note, because a lot of people prefer to have an all-in-one console. So if you're trying to play your physical Game Boy cartridges as well as Game Boy Advance, well, the Retron 5 here can do the job. You'll be greeted with a screen like this when you turn on your Retron 5. You can choose to insert your cards wherever it is that you're choosing to play, and here we're choosing Game Boy Advance. So we're going to start out with a repro cartridge that has a ROM hack on it. And for this specific console, what is actually happening is it's dumping the game file in ROM form to the console itself, and then it is playing it from there, and you can do things like add filters, have save states, all that stuff. That's one of the reasons why this is number 5, is because it is playing it via emulation and not some sort of FPGA style. And when you're doing a fake card, you might say, a repro, a ROM hack, you will always see unknown cartridge here. But as you see, I've got my Hyperkin Scout SNES controller here. I will select play. It'll brief me with this message saying, do you wish to continue anyways? This card is not recognized. Always hit yes, and you'll find that the game does in fact play. So here we have Pokemon Dark Violet version, and this is actually a cart that I wrote myself and modified, so it had the newest version of Dark Violet on there. I'll be covering that in another video. Of course, when playing actual legit game cartridges, you will even get the title of the game listed here when you load the game. Now, for those of you who want to play your Game Boy games, let's see what happens when you put a Game Boy EverDrive in here. Nothing. So it is important to note that the EverDrive does not work on here, at least the Game Boy one. I'm sure the Game Boy Advance one doesn't either. Although you can get a custom memory card to plug into the back, which I have here, which allows you to load up ROMs after you put in a game cartridge. Let's try a legit copy of a Game Boy Color game. Dave Mirra Freestyle BMX. Let's try a legit regular Game Boy game. This is Boomer's Adventure. Look, that one loaded up right away. So that's good. Now when it comes to physical ROM hacks, especially the Game Boy cartridges, it's really a hit or miss, but let's see what happens here. Sometimes they'll work, sometimes they won't. And this time, it really didn't. In conclusion, this method isn't for everyone, but it's a pretty awesome option. Alright, number 4. For those of you who don't know, the Nintendo DS actually came with a built-in Game Boy Advance. And what we have here is the DS-ML. This is a reshelled original DS that you can find on places like AliExpress. It's pretty affordable. The DS, as well as the ML, both have a lower quality screen. So you can play your games here, but there are some things to note. Firstly, you have 2 screens, and you're only going to be utilizing one of them, and the options you can choose to play your games on the top or bottom screen. However, the level of backlight on this specific console is pretty poor, and the resolution is not great. As you can see, you have the option to turn on or off the backlight. But that's all. We can still play Game Boy Advance cartridges. Even ROM hacks. Unfortunately, you cannot play your Game Boy or Game Boy Color cartridges. When it comes to the DS or the DS-ML, you don't have the option of doing video out on the TV. You have a pretty dim screen, a fairly small screen, and you do not have the option to play Game Boy or Game Boy Color games. However, since it is an actual handheld device, I've placed this at number 4. Alright, number 3 would be the DS Lite. And this would maybe be some people's preference of playing Game Boy Advance games, but it's probably because that's what they have. Now, the DS Lite does have better screens and a better backlight. Much brighter and larger. One slight drawback is the fact that due to the smaller shell and form factor, the game cartridge does stick out the bottom, whereas the original DS and ML sit flush. And yes, you can play your ROM hacks. When it comes to the form factor, the DS-L is fairly smaller than, say, the ML. And some might find that as a disadvantage if they have large hands. This one might actually be a little more comfortable to hold. However, the gameplay experience is just far more improved on the DS-L, even though your cartridge sticks out. Once again, you cannot play your Game Boy or Game Boy Color games, but you can play your Game Boy Advance games. That's why it's at number 3 as a handheld. Number 2. This I covered recently on the channel. It's called the Anbernic K101 Plus, also known as the Revo K101 Plus. It was just recently refreshed and re-released by Anbernic in a new bluish purple color. This is a Game Boy Advance clone. As you can see, it actually takes Game Boy Advance cartridges, and this has some benefits that the DS's lack. The K101 Plus has the option to change resolutions depending on how you want to utilize your screen. The K101 Plus also has a sleep function. The K101 Plus also does video out, although it is only AV. But it works. There are many benefits to the K101 Plus, but it might not be for everybody. This does also do emulation, and it supports things like real-time clocks. I think the buttons are decent, the audio's good, and the screen is not half bad. Another benefit of the K101 Plus is that you can hot swap your cartridges. You can rip out a cartridge and pop another one in there while it's still on, and it just reboots itself and goes right into the next game. It was actually made to do that. When it comes to the K101 Plus versus the DS Lite and the DS or DSML, I can't help but lean far towards the K101 Plus. It's more compact, the screens look better, it's just nicer. As well, this does not play Game Boy or Game Boy Color cartridges, just like these two. And that puts this at number 2. Now, the obvious option for number 1 is going to be an actual Game Boy Advance. And there are several options when it comes to this these days. You can buy an original Game Boy Advance with no backlight and play it like it used to be way back in the day, though I don't really recommend experiencing your Game Boy Advance cartridges that way anymore. You can do it, and you can find them for, maybe if you're lucky, $50 to $70. You can also have one built custom by websites like SocalGameboy.com. What this is a fully reshelled Game Boy Advance with upgraded audio, upgraded buttons, and an IPS screen. And on a modded Game Boy Advance, you have options like adjusting your brightness, playing ROM hacks, playing original Game Boy games, and you can even utilize your full screen, as well as Game Boy Color. The Game Boy Advance can do any type of EverDrive made for the Game Boy or Game Boy Advance consoles. When it comes down to it, the Game Boy Advance is the best way to play your Game Boy Advance cartridges, but it's not the only way. And these days it might become harder and harder to find a Game Boy Advance to your liking unless you want to drop a lot of money. So, aside from the Retron 5, I led from the cheapest to the most expensive options here, as the ML would be the cheapest, and then the DS Lite, and then the K101 Plus, and then a Game Boy Advance. You can get a Game Boy Advance SP that closes like a clam shell, but this is the most comfortable. And you can also modify these to do video out. You know, you can add an extra port on the bottom and dock it and play it like a Nintendo Switch on your TV. It just depends on how far you're willing to go. In addition to the methods that I mentioned today, there are also 2 additional ways you could play Game Boy Advance cartridges that I actually do not have on hand to show you. And one of them is a very expensive method called the Analog Pocket. I'm sure you've heard about it. I'll put a picture on the screen here. And the other is the Retron SQ, if I'm saying that correct. It's a little tiny cube that is basically just the Game Boy Advance portion of the Retron 5. How do you play your Game Boy Advance games? I'd really like to hear it down in the comments. Thanks so much for sticking around till the end of the episode. If you like this, please hit the like button, subscribe if you're not already. It really helps me out and encourages me to make more videos. I've got a lot more coming, so until next time, I'll catch you on the flip side. Peace out.
Well, that was just childhood. We were all there together, and in denial would play like it was forever. And in the tall woods, we'd stay out of the weather like it was all good. Every day we made it for pleasure. We were saying whatever came to our minds, plain and simple like a tetherball reaching the sky. We were taking new heights on the swing while it was making us fly. Beat the king of the hill and everything will be fine. The thrill of everything we would find, the innocence of a child.